As many of you know, we are in the middle of this series in which we are using the Enneagram as a tool to help us to understand ourselves, but also to understand other people as well. I don't think I brought this up before, but the word Enneagram itself stems from two Greek words, Ennea, which means 9, and grammos, which means something that's written or drawn. And it refers to the 9-pointed symbol that has become associated with and used to identify the 9 different types found on the Enneagram of personality. Each of the 9 types featured on the Enneagram is personalized in that each of the personality types have their own unique patterns of thinking and feeling, and they each have their own actions that stem from their inner motivations and worldviews. And although the Enneagram can be seen as similar to other personality profiling systems like the Myers-Briggs or StrengthsFinder personality typing systems, I found it to be different in that it doesn't try to define and spell out who you are as much as it tries to help you to discover who you are not. As I've mentioned in the past, the real purpose of the Enneagram is to help you to see that in many ways, your core fears and your core desires and motivations underlying many of our subconscious thoughts and attitudes are often driving the way that we're living our lives. And it's often driving us towards dysfunction and unhappiness. This shadow side of our personality is what the Enneagram seeks to expose. And many times, we're not even aware of this shadow side of our personality. Or we've come to accept and believe, well, that's just the way that we are, and there's nothing wrong with it because we've lived with it for so long that it's become normalized. And we've become blinded to the ways in which it is actually very harmful to our souls. And so as I've mentioned before, although we may have a tendency to resist being identified as a certain personality type because we think that that then puts us into a box and we don't want to be limited in that way, the reality is the Enneagram helps us to see the box that we are already in because of how our shadow side keeps us within its boundaries, which is exactly what fear does. And the Enneagram will bring that out into the light so that we can see it for what it is and free ourselves from how it has limited us from living fuller and healthier lives. But it's not easy because, as I mentioned, we're often not even aware of the shadow side of our personality because it has become so normalized. And I think this will be evident in the personality type that we look at in our message for today. This morning, we're looking at personality type 3, known as the Achiever. One other book that I read gave the title of Rainmaker to the type 3, who's also known as the Motivator, the Status Seeker, the Professional, the Performer, and the Workaholic. Type 3s are known to be individuals who are driven, competent, confident, ambitious, and charming, but they can also be approval-seeking, arrogant, narcissistic, overly competitive, and superficial. Now, as I've done each week, I'll put up the list of characters from the movie Encanto, in which I believe many of the characters exhibited personality traits that are reflected in the different Enneagram types. This movie was, again, kind of the catalyst that got me to thinking about doing a preaching series on the Enneagram. And so who do you think would likely be classified as an Enneagram type 3? The Achiever, the Performer. I have to admit, this one was not as clear to me as some of the other ones. But the individual that I believe fits into this type of personality is Louisa. I waffled on this a little bit because I believe she might actually be a type 2 helper with a wing 3, but she certainly exhibits many of the core characteristics of a type 3. Louisa is a performer. She is the strong one, the dependable one. And the strength that she has allows her to build or move whatever the family or the village might want her to do, whether that's redirecting the flow of the river that runs near the village or actually picking up and physically moving a church building. Louisa gets the job done better and more efficiently than anyone else. But Louisa harbors a secret, which is the shadow side of her personality. She's worried that deep down inside, she's a fraud, that she isn't nearly as strong as she presents herself to be and that other people see her as, and that if she were to let go of this outer veil of strength and let the rest of her family and village see her for who she truly is, well, then they would see her as a fraud as well. Mirabel is the only one who truly sees Louisa and all of the weight that has been piled upon her shoulders. And in a moment of vulnerability, when Louisa admits to Mirabel that she does feel weak at times, Mirabel encourages her to rest and not to push herself to the limits. But it's hard for Louisa to slow down and stop performing, even when her strength is failing. She continues to press on because it's unacceptable for her to be seen as an underachiever, or worse, as a failure who's let down the most important people in her life. But in that moment of vulnerability with Mirabel, you see the softer underbelly of Louisa that's longing to be known for something other than for what she does or what she can achieve. This need to be seen as strong, to be seen as successful, dominates Three's lives, just as it dominated Louisa's. If you overhear someone describing a type 3 person, you'll probably hear words like inspiring, charming, the most hardworking person I know. Threes are driven by their desire to succeed, whatever form that success might take. They're high-capacity thinkers and doers and are hardwired to figure out what it takes to win in whatever endeavor that they're seeking to accomplish, and then they go out and they make it happen. Threes have a remarkable drive to accomplish their goals and excel at everything that they do. They are relentless in their pursuit to acquire the knowledge or the skills that they need, and then they have the charisma and the grit to get the job done and do it impressively in the process. Outside of work, they can be very charming with the ability to win people over quickly. That's part of a three's aura. They're confident in their skills, and they can switch gears and develop their potential in other areas very quickly. Now, of course, other personalities can also be driven and charming as well, right? And so to understand the difference between a 3 and these other types, you have to know the underlying motivation as to why they function the way that they do. And this is where we begin to dive into the shadow side of the personality type 3. As you can see from this chart of the core desires and core fears that are inherent to each of the personality types, the basic desire of the type 3 is to feel valuable and worthwhile and not disappoint others, whereas their core fear is based on their anxiety hidden beneath their surface, that underneath it all, they're worthless. So like all of the other personality types that are ultimately desiring to be validated for who they truly are, 3s struggle with that too. But whereas 2s, who we looked at last week, will attempt to earn this love by doing and helping others, 3s will attempt to earn this love through their achievements. 3s believe that if people who matter to them, or people at large, admire them, then this admiration is believed by 3s to be the love and the sense of validation that they so deeply desire in their lives. And so they become their namesake. They become performers. And here's how it generally works. Threes are masters at reading people. Like a type 2 that could walk into a party and sense the emotional thermometer of the people that are there and what they need. Threes can walk into a party and have a distinct sense of the type of people who are there, what their preferences are, and what they value. And then a 3 can begin to craft a persona that they believe they need to exhibit in order to win the approval of the crowd. 3s have that kind of ability to instinctively change in response to their environment, and they do this almost reflexively wherever they are. They have the ability to become the prototype of whatever group that they happen to be in and embody the expectations and the values and the attitudes of that group. And it doesn't always have to be with regards to commercial or financial or career success. It could be whatever the defining spirit or attitude of that particular group is. So, for instance, if one of the primary identifying values of that group is that real men aren't afraid to be soft and tender and communicative, well, then these features will immediately begin to form in the personality of the 3. Just as 2s do everything when they are needed, 3s do everything for praise. Praise is the gas that makes the 3's motor run. Where a 3 will run into problems, though, if they stop long enough to take an inventory of their inner world, is that at some point, as you've crafted and lived out the personas that you felt were necessary to meet the approval and admiration of the people around you, you get to a point, eventually, where you can no longer tell the difference between your fake image and your authentic self anymore because you're just so tied to your image. According to the Enneagram, the deadly sin of the achiever is deceit. Not necessarily because they deceive others as much as they actually deceive themselves. As the American novelist Nathaniel Hawthorne once wrote so poignantly, no man for any considerable period can wear one face to himself and another to the multitude without finally getting bewildered as to which may be the true. In crafting a persona that will impress and perhaps even help them to form relationships with high influence people who can help them to get ahead socially and professionally, 3s eventually lose touch with who they authentically are. And where it all started for 3s is that somewhere along the road when they were young and impressionable, they picked up on the message that I am loved for what I do. I am acceptable based on what I can achieve and what I can accomplish. And normally this is passed on from the parental figures in their life who communicate this message to them. Sometimes in obvious and harsh ways, or sometimes in very subtle and indirect ways, maybe through a disapproving look, or how stingy they could be in giving out words of praise and encouragement. The message 3s picked up in childhood is that it's not okay for you to have your own identity. You must become this kind of person, or you must become that kind of person. For 3s, they had to become whatever kind of person the important people in their lives associated with success. Early in life, 3s pick up this wounding message that you are what you do. And so as a result of that, they become high-performance achievement machines, striving to excel and be acknowledged for their accomplishments or for how they're able to embody the virtues promoted by the important people of their lives. But at what cost? Because in the process of taking this journey, they lose touch with their true self. It's not uncommon in the life of a 3 to find out that they've taken an incredible amount of time and energy to master something in life that in the end they don't even like it. It's just what their parents or their friends or their community valued above all else. So they found a way to do it and do it better than just about anyone else. But deep down inside, there's no real joy or satisfaction. But they've learned to deal with that sense of unfulfillment in order to sacrifice their life under the lie that image is everything. Back in the 90s, I don't know if you remember the Canon camera commercial with Andre Agassi, the tennis player. He was in his prime at the time in the tennis world, but he was kind of a rebel, right? That's what he was known for. And that's also what the name of the camera was that he would advertise in his commercial, right? The Canon Rebel. But in his commercial, he was cocky, but fashionably dressed guy, would step out of this white Lamborghini, kind of look at the camera, and then he would lower his Ray-Bans halfway down his nose. And do you remember what he would say? Image is everything. That was the tagline from this commercial. But as it turns out, this was a theme in Andre's personal life as well. In his memoir, Open, Agassi describes growing up with a father whose love for him was tied to his performance on the court. When the book was released not too long ago, the world was shocked to learn that Andre publicly confessed in this book for the first time that he hated playing tennis from the time he first picked up his racket to the day that he retired. He hated playing tennis. What drove him to become a champion wasn't a passion for the game, but his desire to win the heart of a father whom he describes as, and I quote, "He was unable to tell the difference between loving me and loving tennis." This is not an uncommon experience in the lives of many threes who wind up living lives very disconnected from their true selves. It's interesting to me that the type 3 personality is identified in the Enneagram triad as a personality type that primarily functions from their heart versus from their gut or from their head. It's written that 3s are very feeling-based, but they actually have the most difficulty connecting to their feelings more than any other personality type on the Enneagram. And not only will they not pick up on their own feelings, but they won't pick up on your feelings either. In this way, they're somewhat similar to 2s, who also aren't very well aware of their own feelings, but as we shared last week, 2s are very well aware of other people's feelings, and they can hone in on them like a Doppler radar. 3s, they say, are just playing in the dark, so to speak, when it comes to feelings, their own as well as yours. One book I read said that 3s do feelings more than have feelings, which was that author's way of describing that because 3s can't access or recognize their own feelings very well due to having stuffed them so far down, 3s will unconsciously observe how other people are expressing their emotions. And then they'll learn how to copy and emulate them because that's what they're good at doing. At the end of the day, 3s care most about efficiency and completing a task. And feelings are messy, and they slow your progress toward your goal. So 3s in general aren't inclined to spend much time on their feelings to begin with. And they have the ability to compartmentalize their lives in such a way that negative emotions don't necessarily have any bearing on their ability to perform. Which is why I think many of the great athletes of our day, like Andre Agassi, can accomplish what they do under high-stress moments. They are able to set aside and not allow their feelings or their emotions to hinder their performance. Probably the most obvious type 3 in the Bible to me is the character of Jacob in the Old Testament. And I want to share some of my thoughts about him in the remaining time that we have. I'm not going to read his entire story from the Bible because that would take us way too long. So I'm just going to provide you more of a summary of his life. Jacob is the son of Isaac, who was the son of Abraham, whom God called to be the catalyst and the individual from out of which the people of Israel would be formed. Jacob and his older brother Esau were fraternal twins. And the Bible records that even in the womb, Jacob strove to be first. And that when the two sons were born, Esau came out first, but Jacob was holding on to his heel. The name Jacob stands for heel grabber, but it also stands for deceiver. And that's what Jacob became known for. But in reality, his deception was really more a product of his passion to succeed at all costs. At one time, he was able to deceive or trick his older brother into selling him his birthright. In the ancient culture of that time, one's birthright is how the family legacy was passed down. It was generally the older son's natural privilege as the firstborn son to receive that birthright, whereby he would become the head of the family, in charge of the family's welfare and property, and he would receive a double portion of the inheritance, as we learned in the parable of the prodigal son several weeks ago. Plus, it would include the ceremonial blessing that would be given and passed down from the father to the son, and it would place that son in a special covenantal relationship with God. Jacob stole that birthright from his brother. He knew where his brother was weak. He knew how to manipulate him, and he figured out a way to game the system and essentially deceive his brother into selling him his birthright. And as a part of gaming the system, he also figured out a way to deceive his father into giving him the ceremonial blessing that Isaac actually wanted to give to Esau. And he did this by using his father's poor eyesight to his advantage and tricking him into thinking that he was Esau. Jacob's early life reflected the unhealthy side of threes: success at any cost. Failure was not an option to Jacob in his early life, and he left a trail of broken relationships behind him because for unhealthy threes, the end justifies the means. And the end game is always success. But when his life begins to fall apart because of his betrayals and deceit, Jacob picks up and leaves town because facing his relational failures that he has left in the wake of his drive to succeed is not something that unhealthy threes would ever really own up to. So Jacob takes off to his uncle's home, where he winds up over the course of time being deceived himself by his uncle, which I guess that personality type must run in the family. And during the course of this time in his life when the deceiver is being deceived multiple times, Jacob is humbled in the process. By the end of the approximate 20 years that Jacob stayed with Laban, you no longer see him trying to game the system or trick his uncle back. It seems that he's turned a corner in his life and he's no longer trying to win at all costs. Instead, he's learned to work hard for what he wants, learning that his efforts will pay off in the end if he is patient enough to follow through. This was a big learning time in Jacob's life, but the ultimate challenge comes when he makes the decision to return home and confront his past and his broken relationship with his brother. Probably one of the most difficult things for threes to ever do. While making his way back home, he has this encounter with God, that would leave him crippled. It's one of the more strange incidences in the Bible. Jacob wrestles with an angel, or maybe even with God himself. The text isn't clear. And although he wrestles valiantly, he essentially loses. But failure doesn't seem to have the same impact on Jacob anymore. It doesn't seem to be something that's going to cause him to turn away and run. Because that's, one of the core fears of a type 3 personality on the Enneagram, a deep fear of being seen as incompetent that causes type 3s to be unwilling to experience and process through most any kind of failure in their lives. A mature 3 has learned, and I think this is a lesson that we all need to learn, I know I do, that sometimes the best thing that can happen to us is failure. Because ultimately, we learn more from our failures than we learn from our successes. 3s want to avoid failure at all costs, but it's the very thing that can lead them to growth and transformation. And I think that's generally true across all the personality types on the Enneagram. The pathway to healing and wholeness and growth is to face the deepest fear of our personality type. Because only then will we truly be able to transcend it and live outside of the box that it's kept us in. When Jacob finally does come face to face with Esau, things weren't nearly as bad as he imagined they were going to be, which is normally the case when it comes to our fears. Of all people, his twin brother, Esau, knew all about Jacob's past. He knew all about his deceptions and his failures, and yet he doesn't hold it against him in that moment. Jacob was prepared to meet a brother who was hell-bent on taking his revenge for all that Jacob had taken from him, but to his surprise, he wasn't greeted with hostility. He was greeted with open arms and with forgiveness. It's actually one of the very first moments of grace that you'll find in the Bible. And this kind of grace is ultimately what 3s are searching for in their lives, if they'll ever just slow down enough and allow themselves to be vulnerable and open to receive it, which is one of the hardest things that they'll ever do. Because 3s have lived with this fear for so long that they instinctively now have a hard time believing that underneath all the layers of their image, their truth self is actually worthy of love and acceptance. Because they know their own deceitfulness and vanity. They know their own faults that they've been trying to hide from the rest of the world. And when those faults and failures and shortcomings and sins are laid bare for all the world to see, and yet they find that they are still forgiven and loved anyway, if they can get to that place, they'll find that their greatest fear is actually the source of their greatest joy. And so if that's you, or maybe someone you know, I hope this will help you to understand the pathway forwards towards the healing and the wholeness that you've struggled all of your life to find. Let's pray together. Lord, I think there's a little bit, if not a lot, of 3 in many of us here, given the culture and the environment that we've grown up in. The desire to perform, to be the kind of person that important people feel that they want us to be, or to read the temperature of the room and what other people feel are important, and to automatically, almost instinctively, Lord, begin to build our image around that. In part, I think 9s kind of do that, Lord, in order to keep the peace. And yet, the more we do that, the more we lose ourselves, Lord. The more further our true selves goes underground, until eventually we aren't even in touch with it anymore.